5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Hello, I'm Lauren.
Hey everyone, and I'm Ernest.
And together we're L&E Explore Books. Today we have a couple of books that we have either finished or are in the process of reading. And so, yeah, I can get us started. So I talked a little bit about this book last time, and this is called Glow Kids. It's by Nicholas Carderas. And explicitly, it's talking about how screen addiction is hijacking our kids and how to break the trance. So I would say overall for this book, I think there are some valid points within the work. I definitely think a tech addiction is real, whether that's a social media addiction, whether that's video game addiction, whatever kind of that tech-related addiction is. I will say, though, I feel like this work has some evidence within it. It definitely cites sources, but I feel like it's just interesting because it really picks and chooses kind of elements of this. Like an example is it talks about video game addictions. When it's talking about video gaming addiction, though, it often is really talking about particularly violent video game addiction. And so there are several examples of cases that have happened in the media. And within those cases, it talks about murder, it talks about harm to others, it talks about just this change in behavior, and it's very much talking about the implication that violent video games had a part in that. And Ernest and I actually dialogued about this a little bit, and I totally agree that that could 100% be a factor within that, and could, but I do think that it is not the only factor. I think there are a lot of other layers, right, to all of these stories. I also think that there is not really in the research. It's really interesting. You see some research says no impact, some research says look at this impact, but how they get that impact. So as someone who also games, I think it's really interesting reflecting on my own experience with this. I mean, my games that I typically play are games like Harvest Moon and Animal Crossing. I like community collaborative gaming, but I've also played games that have included violence. And when they talk about violent video games, they mean video games explicitly that show gore, that show blood, and any sort of disembowelment, things like that within a video game is what they're really talking about. They called out Call of Duty and Grand Theft Auto as two of the bigger regions. And again, I think this is a really interesting dialogue because what it's talking about specifically is addiction. It's not saying everyone who plays a violent video game, this is their experience. But I feel like it's still not fully nuanced. I also think that this work definitely has an agenda. I mean, you can tell that reading the first, even the title of the work. And so I found that it was meaningful. It definitely is making me reflect on my screen time use, but I wouldn't necessarily feel like this is the book that gave a lot of practical solution. It talked a lot about if you know someone has an intensive addiction to technology, how do we be proactive in this work instead of just all right, this child already has an addiction, so this is what we do. So I think that, and the options they gave for that were kind of nature institutes or tech institutes, and most of them were specifically for between the ages of 13 and 18. So overall, I think that it's an interesting work. I am not going to be keeping this work. It will be going in my giveaway pile, but I think that I still appreciated parts of it.
Yeah, and I like the dialogue that we had, and video games and technology are more of a contributing factor to certain things, but I do understand that it can be something that becomes so much of something that you get so attachment from that's the only thing that brings you desire. I think a lot of it has to do with just finding other outlets that are important. So I think doing this reading has allowed me have more time to say, hey, let me put my shows down or my video game controller down to focus on things such as reading and more important things like my schooling right now to get that accomplished. To make me think of, instead of me gaming during the weekdays, I wait until the weekend when all my work is done before doing that. And I think that's kind of the good activity that helped me kind of get over being too excited about video games most of the time.
Definitely, and something that they talk a lot about in this book is how video games are used as an escape, or technology in general is used as an escape because real life is hard and complicated. And I do think that's really valid, that folks are trying to find outlets that work for them. What he doesn't talk about in this book that I told Ernest I think is important in this conversation is how socioeconomic status plays a role within some of this dialogue. And like, what does it look like when you feel like there aren't safe places for your children to play? What does it look like when you feel like there aren't inside? Correct, you'd rather have them inside, or there aren't really a lot of affordable opportunities for your student that feel like something that they can participate within. Or if your student like loves games and that's something they become really interested in, I think they gave several examples of how challenging it can be to like limit that space. And so I do think that conversations on tech, I think one of the best things that can be done is just like talking and engaging with folks on like what is a healthy amount of technology. Because I do appreciate that this book is not like anti-technology. Like there's an acknowledgement that we absolutely will be using technology in our world. That it's really talking about what happens when it becomes extreme. I mean, this book talks a lot about people who are like gaming like 18 hours a day and like peeing into a plastic water bottle. Like that's kind of the level. They're talking about like addiction, not someone who's like, I play like an hour of Animal Crossing. It's fun. I turn off my system. So, yeah.
My book I finished this week is ReZero, Starting Life in Another World. This is actually a Japanese light novel that is a source for anime that is pretty popular right now on Crunchyroll. If you don't know about that, the book is for 13 and up. The reason I would recommend books like this, especially after talking about little kids, is that if you have a student or a child who just likes animation, I think this is a good alternative instead of just like reading comic books or watching the anime that you could read instead. It's a really good book. I think the only things I should warn you about are that it talks about death. It's based off a Japanese genre called isekai. The main character is someone who is, like in our world, who is reincarnated or teleported into another world. And they are usually granted a special ability or something that gives them, lets them like live out their fantasy, almost like a never-ending story-esque story, I would say. And with this character, Subaru Netsuki, his ability is that whenever he dies, he gets to restart over at a point, like a checkpoint in his chapter, and he has to figure out a puzzle, whatever puzzle is in his way, in order to make sure he survives on to the next one. I just think this story allowed me to see that I'm really more of a reader who likes to read the source material first before watching the show. Because after reading this, after having watched a lot of the ReZero anime, I noticed that reading wasn't as much as enjoyable because I knew everything was going to happen because of the anime media. And I believe having the source material and just reading it yourself, I would have been allowed to just see the connection points even better and understood like the little things that the anime cuts out. So yeah, again, another point of you should always read the source material, read the book before you actually go see the visual media representation of it. So yeah, I think it's good. As a parent, I would say definitely read it yourself and look if you have a student or a child who's interested in reading this sort of book, just check it out for yourself. And the dialogue is very middle grade, reaching for the 13 years and up, but it can be, gore if you don't want your child reading something about like bowels being cut out of someone. So yeah.
We had a lot of bowel conversation today and disemboweling. So this next book is called One of Us is Lying by Karen M. McManus. So I finished this work, and for me, I wasn't super amazed, but I will say that I think that's really more of a reflection on who I am as a reader and what really interests me. As Ernest and I talked about it, I love thrillers and I love like amateur sleuth type novels, and so that is a genre that I tend to read. And this one, to me, I think that there were some clever aspects of it, and it was interesting and there was a lot of thought processing, but it's so interesting because it almost is like, let me rely on this stereotype and then I'm gonna switch up the stereotype or mix it up. And though that works at some level, it felt like it was kind of like, oh, I'm trying really hard not to create stereotypical characters. And so, an example, there are 5 main characters really in this book. 4 of the main characters are accused of murdering the 5th character. So the character who is dead is Simon. And Simon was basically creating like a Gossip Girl online platform, essentially. And so Simon would post dirt, essentially, about everyone at his high school. Like, he would get receipts. And the reason why it was such a big deal is that Simon's information was always accurate. Like, he was never wrong on what he was posting in gossip. And he never posted anyone's explicit name. He would post initials. But he clearly, like, was doing the digging and had just, like, crazy good sources. So he was about to release a secret about the 4 other characters that were in the room when he died. And so this book is really talking about, like, which of them did this? Was it one of the 4 of them that did this? Why? What was their secret also? Right. And if the secret actually was their biggest secret, that was an interesting component of the book, was even like, what was that secret, and was there more secrets including that secret? And I think overall it is an interesting YA mystery novel. I think if you enjoy teen and young adult, like high school kind of drama and clickiness and fiction, and that there's a lot of interesting material. I will say for me, it was just really hard because there are so many content warnings, and it just felt like it wasn't quite exciting enough for me to have so many content warnings. So some of the content warnings would be suicide, murder, there would be a public outing of a character, there is domestic violence, there is, I would say, manipulation within this work, there is family shaming, there's just so many layers of identity. There is drug addiction, there is alcoholism. So it just deals with a lot of real and heavy topics that teenagers might be dealing with within their own lives or the community surrounding them. And I do appreciate the author does include resources for those particular topics at the end of the book to support folks. I do actually wish, particularly in the case of this book, that was at the beginning of the book. I think that it's good to have that material, but I also do think that this is a really... it's supposed to be lighthearted in places, but it's also quite dark. So again, I think I've heard from a lot of folks that this was a book that they super enjoyed. I didn't hate it. Like, it wasn't like it was a bad book. It just wasn't my favorite that I've read.
Thank you. Moving on to our books that we're currently reading or going to start reading. So for me, update on Imaginary Friends. It's going to take me a lot longer. I don't have as much time as I would love to just dive into it. So instead, I'm going to treat Imaginary Friends like an assignment for school. So my idea is that I'm going to read 50 pages a day for the next 2 weeks and have it done by the second week. But for next week, I'm going to focus on a book I mentioned in our... So the book I'm going to be reading, I actually talked about in our Olympia episode. The book I'm reading is Lovecraft Country by Matt Ruff. So Lovecraft Country is about Atticus Turner. He is a 22-year-old war veteran that received a letter from his father saying that he's gone missing in a sundown town. So Atticus, being a son and worried about his father, is going to go look for him. This book is actually now currently an HBO series. So instead of me I watched like 3 episodes of the series with Lauren. I stopped because I realized it was a book and I wanted to read it before actually watching more of the show, unlike I did with ReZero. So I'm excited to actually read this book. It deals with a lot of heavy topics like the Green Book that African Americans had to deal with, on knowing establishments and safe places they can go to, and areas that they won't be treated with hate or prejudice or with the threat of violence or death to them just for the color of their skin. So this book will have those warnings if you're dealing with possibilities of people dying and racism across America. It's set in the 1954, and I'm just really excited to read this book and let you know what I thought about it. So, yeah.
Yeah, and my book that I'm currently reading, I'm actually almost done with this book, so I'm excited to share my thoughts more fully next week, is Zadie Smith's Intimations. And this work was actually created at the start of the quarantine. Thank you so much, Jennifer, for lending me this work. What it is really talking about is pondering a lot of the essential questions of who we are as humans. I think one of the questions that they talked about that I'm super interested in is, what does it mean to submit to a new reality or resist it? And how do we compare relative sufferings? And so just big topics and engagements in our world currently and what it looks like. I really love this. The author is using a lot of narratives and short story formatting to create really engaging questions and also just narrate in a way that feels like we're having a conversation. So I really enjoy it because it feels like an intimate conversation with the author where we're exploring a lot of topics and ideas together. So I so far am loving this and would definitely recommend it. It's also a really short read. It's under 100 pages. So I think that this could be a really wonderful book to engage with, and also I feel like just feel some validation in how other people are experiencing our world currently, and what does that mean to, I think, what does it mean to be someone who's currently in the middle of a global pandemic? Yeah, those are all of our books. So next week we're really excited. We're actually going to be doing a special episode. So we both love spooky season. And so next week we're actually going to dress up in our costume, which we'll explain our costume in the episode. And we're going to share some of our favorite spooky season reads. Yeah. So get ready to hear some of the books that we were like, if you're looking for something spooky, we've got the one for you. So if you have some spooky season favorites, please let us know. Or if you have any comments or questions on anything we talked about in this episode, we would love to hear from you. Thank you so much for listening. Have a great rest of your day.
Bye, everyone.